What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the past weekend's large events and talk about the absolute bleeding edge of the metagame. And this time, it's actually a pretty exciting week because it was a very big week for Warhammer. And not just singles events like we normally cover on this series, but we also had tons of team events. I, myself, am recording this on the road on my way back from the NATC, North American Team Championship. That was an almost 500-player team event, running both a large 5-player team event alongside an 8-player team event. That was co-streamed by both myself and Joe from over at War Games Live. I streamed the 8-player team event that used a WTC style, and if you go over to War Games Live, you can check out his coverage of the 5-player team event. Lots and lots of 40k being covered this weekend. Now, we're not going to be talking about those lists on this video because we don't typically cover team lists. They have a lot of different requirements for success over what is the more commonly played style of 40k, which is the singles. However, it is good to keep in mind the number of team events that occurred this weekend. We had multiple large GT or major level team events occurring around the world. But that's not all. We also had tons of singles events, including the enormous, almost 300 player Sheffield Super Major. So still lots to talk about this week for non-team results. Before we dive into the video, I want to give a shout out, as always, to the supporters of the channel, the patrons that you can join over on patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members you can join in the link down below the video, and Twitch subscribers, you can find me over on my Twitch channel. All you guys help me get out to these events and cover these results, and I really appreciate it. And with that, let's dive into a Metagame breakdown of the factions that did well this week. Now, we are seeing a little bit of a consolidation this week, as opposed to previous weeks where we saw mostly well-distributed results amongst a variety of different factions. This week was very heavily dominated by some non-Codex compliant Space Marine chapters, as well as some other factions that I think are maybe a little bit surprising. Blood Angels came out with 3 undefeated results at Hometown 40k, at the Sheffield Super Major, and the Ciudad de Avila GT. Now, the Sheffield Super Major used a top 4 cut system, and so it actually didn't really have any undefeated players, at least undefeated players that played all the way through the end of the top cut. I will be talking about all 4 top cut lists in this breakdown, since those players at least went 5-0 at that event. Editing Trevi here with a little bit of a correction. I'm not really sure how the placement breakdown of this event ended up like this. There was actually another player in the top cut who got, I don't know, booted out by the top cut by the system is what it looks like, playing Necrons. So there is an undefeated Necron list at the Sheffield Super Major as well. We'll be talking about them. On top of that, they are actually undefeated, 7-0. The other players are somewhere around 6-1. Speaking of Sheffield Super Major results, Dark Angels are also up here. The J-Town Throwdown and Sheffield Super Major saw high-placing Dark Angels lists. Adeptus Mechanicus went undefeated at Exterminatus 9. That event was streamed by the Australis Wargaming Network. I'll drop a link down to their YouTube channel in the video description so you can find their coverage of Australian events. Cool to see lots of streaming going on for 40k around the world. Adeptus Mechanicus also did extremely well at the Sheffield Super Major, which is what we're going to be talking about this week. Adepta Sororitas also undefeated at Exterminatus 9, as well as the Denver Fight Club. Chaos Space Marines won the Midsummer OPA, as well as also having a player in the top 4 at the Sheffield Super Major. And Astra Militarum won both the Yeehaw GT and the Tabletop Gaming Expo 40k GT. That event was covered by our friends over at Tabletop Live. I'll drop a link down to their live stream in the video description as well, so you can find their coverage of that event. We also saw some singleton factions that only had 1 undefeated result this week. Genestealer Cults at the Hometown 40k GT, as well as World Eaters at the J-Town Throwdown. Exciting to see Genestealer Cults at the top here, because I know the new codex has been rough on the faction, but players are starting to make it work, and that is cool. Super interesting set of results this week. Definitely not quite as populous in terms of the factions that are being represented as we've seen in previous weeks. Some of that might have been a draw of talent from these factions over to team events. Team events tend to kind of capitalize on faction specialists because an 8-player team needs players from a variety of factions. So with hundreds of those players going to these large team events this weekend, those players are then unable to compete at these singles tables. I don't know if that's entirely the case or whether we are actually seeing a progression of the metagame towards these fewer top factions that are doing well. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure we'll find out over the next couple of weeks as we move further into the Pariah Nexus season. And with that, let's move on to the lists, starting with the Ciudad de Avila GT. Casualine Waif went undefeated with Blood Angels, and this was a super spicy Blood Angels Gladius task force. It was bringing Lamarties as well as an Apothecary Biologus with Fire Discipline to turn on the Fire Discipline combo for an Eradicator squad. For utility, we also had an Intercessor squad as well as 2 units of Assault Jump Pack Intercessors, 1 Infiltrator squad as well as 2 Scout squads, and a big unit of 10 Death Company Marines for Lamarties to join into. On top of that, we also then saw a ton of Blood Angels unique vehicles, including 2 Ball Predators equipped with Flamestorm cannons, 3 Death Company Dreadnoughts. These guys did get, I would say, I don't know if a little bit of a bonus, but a clarification in their favor in the most recent rules update that clarified that if they are attacked in the fight phase, they are indeed allowed to use their reactive fight infinite times during that fight phase. Although the rules were clarified a little bit that they do not, in fact, pile in if shot at. So if they are attacked with ranged attacks, they cannot pile into an enemy and choose to make melee attacks against them. They must respond with their ranged attacks unless they're already engaged. A little bit of a strange ruling on that one, but at least there's the clarification since they use fight on target abilities were a little bit unclear until the June update. Super cool to see 3 of these guys on the table. Because they are Death Company units, they tend to lose their objective control characteristic pretty quickly, but being these kind of brute force, just blunt instruments of destruction, you can just throw them in using the Gladius Task Force abilities to send them into the depths of your opponent's army and absolutely make things difficult for them. We then saw a Librarian Dreadnought to act as a little bit of an initiator for that Fire Discipline Eradicator squad. It's impossible to hide from those guys when they have the ability to potentially teleport around the table at any point. You can also use it as a bonus to your utility units. Things like Infiltrators, Scouts, and Intercessors can be thrown by that guy's Wings of Sanguinius to go complete objectives depending on what you draw. He's a pretty useful toolbox. Plus, he also hits pretty hard in melee in the late game, so he kind of anchors your army fairly well. So it's cool to see that guy on the table. This is a super unique list from Blood Angels this week. We're not seeing the sort of just glut of Death Company Marines that we typically do. Instead, running into some of those Dreadnoughts and other unique Blood Angels units, and definitely goes to show you that the Blood Angels faction, not only is it good, but it also has a variety of good archetypes. Now, speaking of archetypes, let's continue to dive into Dark Angels lists. We're going to be moving over to the J-Town Showdown, where Bryce Watson took Dark Angels to an undefeated record with a Inner Circle task force. Now, this was the new and improved detachment that saw huge updates in the recent June balance update. Previously, you selected an objective marker to get your Deathwing units +1 to wound against enemies on that objective marker. Now, you can either select an objective marker you control to gain that bonus, or instead choose to make an aggressive push and use this ability on every objective marker you do not control. This will basically mean that if your opponent is pushing forward and preventing you from scoring, you can get that +1 to wound bonus for all your Deathwing infantry units on everything they have that is on an objective. Importantly, because it works on things that you do not control, it also works on objectives that are contested, so it's incredibly difficult to play around while not giving the Inner Circle Task Force huge bonuses of victory points when they go to score. In this Inner Circle Task Force, we saw a Terminator Ancient with Deathwing Assault that lets him arrive from Deep Strike during your first movement phase, regardless of any mission rules. We also saw Azrael, a Terminator Chaplain, as well as a Judiciary. Now, Azrael, like all of the Dark Angels special characters, has the bonus of having the Deathwing keyword himself, despite not being a big Terminator guy. This allows you to confer that Deathwing keyword to other units that are not necessarily Deathwing Terminators. Because the detachment ability works on any attack, not simply melee attacks, you can use these special characters to join into shooting units and gain the +1 to wound effect on them as well. I'm not 100% sure if we're making use of that effect in this list because it is extremely melee focused. It is bringing an Assault Intercessor squad. Oftentimes you take those guys with a Judiciary to act as a little bit of a fight firsting Counterpuncher that can heroically intervene to save your Terminator units. We have an Impulsor to get those guys or the unit of Inner Circle companions that are in the unit as well up the table, alongside a bunch of utility. One Infiltrator squad, a Scout squad, a Calidus Assassin, as well as a unit of Assault Intercessor jump packs. To provide fire support, we saw 2 Predator Destructors with las cannons and their turret-mounted autocannons, and then a ton of Deathwing Knights, making up the main bulk of the list. 3 units of 5 of those guys that could join in, with one with the Terminator Chaplain and one with the Terminator Ancient. We then saw what is probably the bodyguard for Azrael, 6 Inner Circle Companions. The big downside of those guys, while they can impact your opponent with a -1 to hit effect, they don't have any invulnerable saves, so they can be kind of squishy against medium or high AP attacks. However, if you attach Azrael into the unit, he obviously makes up for that with his Lion's Helm by giving them a 4+ invulnerable save, also giving them sustained hits, which they can then use their lethal hitting 2-handed swing to get both sustained and lethals on that pretty high value attack, which, with +1 to wound, kind of goes absolutely crazy. With the new changes in the June update, Inner Circle Companions and Deathwing Knights both are incredibly strong. We've seen these guys see some play. Even in the games that I streamed over the weekend, we saw some really, really cool gameplay out of armies like this, although that was a Gladius task force, not an Inner Circle task force, but it definitely gives a new lease on life to the entirety of the Dark Angels army with a lot of new interesting builds thanks to these updated units. Now, before we move off the power armored factions, let's move over to Chaos Space Marines, the dark reflection of the Space Marine faction. At the Midsummer OPAGT, Orestin Argyropoulos went undefeated with a Pact-bound Zealot Chaos Space Marine list. Since the recent nerfs to Chaos Space Marines that changed Renegade Raiders is still fairly popular, but I think a lot of players have moved away from that and towards either Pact-bound Zealots or Soulforge Warpack. Both of those are relatively popular right now, and we do see some other outliers like Chaos Cults making an appearance too. Orestis in this list was running Abaddon the Despoiler plus a Demon Prince with wings equipped with Intoxicating Elixir and a Master of Possession. We had a shooting battery made up of 2 Mark of Nurgle Chaos Forge Fiends, a unit of Slaneshi Warp Talons to attrition their opponent down by using their improved sustained hits thanks to the Mark of Slanesh, plus the ability to advance and charge to get extreme threat ranges, kill their target, and then use Warp Strike to teleport away. 2 units of Raptors, as well as a unit of Cultists to act as utility, with the bulk of the infantry being composed of 15 Chaos Possessed, alongside 5 Chaos Terminators, probably acting as the bodyguard for Abaddon. Now that Abaddon actually has to go see his target in order to use his ability to generate command points from performing Dark Pacts, he does sometimes need a little bodyguard, so he can move up aggressively and target enemies with his bolter. And with that, let's move on to the big event of the weekend, the Sheffield Super Major, which was podiumed by Johnny Simmons running Adeptus Mechanicus, using a Skitarii Hunter cohorts, the infantry-focused Skitarii detachment. This was the most popular detachment prior to the June update, and now that the army has a little bit more teeth to it, it is still extremely effective, especially with some of the new melee options that Adeptus Mechanicus have access to. Johnny was running 3 Skitarii Marshals, one of them with the Cantic Thrallnet, one of them with the Battlesphere uplink. With the new and improved Doctrina Imperative abilities, the Cantic Thrallnet is a huge upgrade to a Skitarii Marshal. It allows you to choose to take the Conqueror Doctrina to buff your melee units and make your units a little bit more aggressive, while also affecting your gun line with the Protector Imperative to give them a little bit more punching power in the shooting phase. So you can really get the best of both worlds out of both sides of the army ability. That Battlesphere uplink also allows the attached Marshal to move after shooting, and this list was using multiple Scorpius Dune Riders to trigger fire support off of their embarked Skitarii units, so the Battlesphere uplink both gives that Skitarii Marshal more flexibility with the positioning of his unit, but also allows him to potentially move back and re-embark into a transport and get fire support multiple turns as long as that transport survives. In order to attach those characters, we also had 2 units of Skitarii Rangers and 3 units of Skitarii Vanguard, alongside those 2 Scorpius Dune Riders I mentioned previously. The gun line being affected by that Protector Imperative was 3 Iron Strider Ballistari with Cognus las cannons, a 6 model unit of arc rifle equipped Cataphren Breachers, plus a ton of aggressive close combat and melee units. 3 units of 5 Tyraxi Sky Stalkers to act as utility and extremely fast objective grabbers, 1 unit of 10 Tyraxi Sterilizers to clear enemies off of their objectives, plus 2 units of Sicarian Infiltrators to secure the positioning of those Deep Strikers in the midboard by blocking out enemy forward operators, and a unit of Sicarian Rust Stalkers. Since the Sicarian Rust Stalkers gain bonuses to advance and charge when they're near battle line units, and we do have 50 battle line models in the army, and you can use expedited purge protocols within the Skitarii Hunter cohort to give the unit advance and charge. These guys have an extremely long threat range, and they are one of the big reasons that you would want to choose Conqueror Doctrina to improve their weapon skill. And with their newly improved melee profiles with more attacks, these guys are a legitimate melee threat now, especially against light or medium infantry units, and they force your opponent to play around the fact that you could send a brick of these dudes at any point into their objectives, clear off their objective holders, clear off their utility units, maybe even kill some heavier melee units, and flip those objectives to then continuously decontrol using their Skystalkers and other Skitarii units. This army has always been about primary objective control and outscoring the opponent, and with the new updates to their weapon profiles, they are now just better at also killing you, which is certainly a good place to be for Adeptus Mechanicus, and it's cool that we saw multiple Adeptus Mechanicus lists undefeated this week, because that is clearly working out for them. Moving on to Astra Militarum. Nick Jagiello went undefeated with the faction at the TGX 40k event. Again, this was streamed over by Tabletop Live, so you could go watch coverage of the event over there. Nick was running a combined regiment led by Lord Solar Leontis, a tank commander with Grand Strategist to give him an additional order issuance, as well as a Tempestus command squad. We saw 4 Chimeras in the list. Those guys largely carrying around a combination of Bulgrin and Ogrin. We saw 2 units of 3 Ogrin and 2 units of 3 Bulgrin, as well as a big unit of 6 that was obviously not embarked into the transports because it's too big. That gives the army an immense amount of midboard presence. The Chimeras are really difficult to kill efficiently. They're very inexpensive, but still have a solid defensive profile. And once you kill them, you have to deal with these feel no pain, multi-wound, heavy infantry that disembark out, and especially those Bulgrins, stacking that with a -1 damage effect. They are extremely difficult to knock out once you've killed their transports. Forcing your opponent to move out in the open is the name of the game for Astra Militarum, and in order to counterattack that, we also saw a Rapier Laser Destroyer, a big unit of 10 Tempestus Scions for that Tempestus Scion command squad to jump into, get hit rerolls when targeting enemies and objectives, sustained hits from the attached Tempestor Prime, and just melting people with mass, Meltagun, and Plasma Gun shooting. We also had 2 additional units of 5 Tempestus Scions to act as utility, and then 2 Leman Russ Exterminators. These guys using their Exterminator autocannons to give +1 AP to anything shooting at their target, which even allows you to get some pretty reasonable work out of the small arms shooting from things like the Tempestus squads. The Ogrin squads, honestly, pretty decent shooting, as well as just the mass number of heavy bolter and lasgun shots that we get out of all of these Chimeras. Backing that up was also 2 units of Attilan Rough Riders, so anything that was foolish enough to tangle with the Chimeras and the Bulgrin in the center could then just get countercharged by those extremely lethal Rough Riding units. This is a super duper creative build for Astra Militarum. Very rarely do we see a combination using Ogrin squads alongside Chimeras. Normally that place gets taken by things like Deathcore of Krieg or Catachan Jungle Fighters to give the Chimeras scout and move them farther up the table. Instead, we're going for resilience with this list and counterattacking with the pretty solid both melee and ranged attacks that Militarum have access to. It's definitely interesting to see the faction transform itself after the nerfs to indirect fire. It has moved almost entirely away from being an artillery-focused, very passive army to being what is ostensibly a very aggressive, kind of objective control-oriented army that's trying to threaten control of objectives in order to force the opponent to play a fair game of 40k with them, which the Militarum will win with the overwhelming numbers of tanks and men that they can throw into the fight. And with that, we'll move on to the last Imperium sub-faction we have to talk about, Adepta Sororitas, who had 2 undefeated results, and today we're going to be covering the Denver Fight Club GT, which was won by Colin K. Colin was running the Bringers of the Flame detachment, the aggressive assault-oriented detachment that makes all your weapons into assault weapons and gives them additional strength bonuses when they're close to the enemy. He was running a Canoness with the Iron Surplus of Saint Istilela, alongside a Dialogus with Fire and Fury to give sustained hits or additional torrent attacks to her attached unit, Morbin Val, and the Triumph of St. Catherine, which I think are basically auto-includes in Sisters lists at this point. A single Battle Sister squad 2 Immolators, and a Rhino in order to carry a combination of those Battle Sisters as well as the 2 Retributor squads in the army. We saw 2 units of 5 Retributors, both of them equipped with 4 Multi-Meltas. Those could be attached in with the Dialogus to give them the sustained hits from that Fire and Fury effect, and with those weapons going to Strength 10, thanks to the Bringers of the Flame ability, they do some pretty serious damage, especially alongside the other saving throw reduction abilities from elsewhere in the list. For example, the 2 Battle Cannon equipped Castigators, as well as the Ignore Cover provided by the Immolators themselves. We then had a unit of Paragon Warsuits from Morven Vault to join into, 2 Penitent Engines, as well as a Sisters Novitiate squad and a Calidus Assassin to act as forward operators. And that was assigned to the factions that only saw a single undefeated result. First off, let's talk about some World Eaters. Josh Wilson went undefeated with a World Eaters Berserker Warband at the J-Town Throwdown. He was running Angron, Lord Invocatus to give some additional scout, plus a Lord on Juggernaut with the Favorite of Khorne to potentially reroll those Blessing of Khorne rolls and get more chances to either get the Blessings of Khorne that you want or return Angron from the dead, which is incredibly important. We had 1 unit of Jackals, as well as 3 units of 2 Chaos Spawn to act as utility, 2 World Eaters Forge Fiends, which is an incredibly important inclusion. Having ranged attacks in a World Eaters army is something that I always espouse, because it forces your opponent to play differently against you. They can no longer just bubble wrap their units and position perfectly to defeat an aggressive melee push, because you can just shoot them to death if they do that. But that is being backed up by 4 units of 8-bound, 3 units of Exalted 8-bound, as well as 1 unit of Standard 8-bound. That is 2 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound, 1 unit of 6 Exalted 8-bound, and a basic unit of 3 regular 8-bound as well to act as the primary melee aggressors of the army. Now, as I mentioned before, there was 1 undefeated list from the Sheffield Super Major. This was Andy Quas Cohen's Hypercrypt Legion Necrons. Necrons are still doing their thing with their Hypercrypt Legions and their ability to jump around, and it seems like this more ranged-oriented version of the Hypercrypt Legion, alongside the Silent King, is becoming the favored Necron list post the June update. Andy's list included a Catan Shard of the Nightbringer to act as a melee counterpunch. That was followed up by the Silent King, the great man himself, able to project his force multiplication auras as well as his own impressive shooting. That was supporting 2 Doomsday Arcs, as well as a Tesseract Vault. These things are enormously damaging ranged attackers, and all of them benefit enormously from the Silent King's auras, as well as their ability to redeploy around the table. For utility, we also had 2 Hexmark Destroyers, one of them with Dimensional Overseer in order to allow more units to hyperphase each turn, 2 units of 5 Deathmarks, and 2 units of 5 Flayed Ones. It definitely seems like these shooting-oriented, potentially Tesseract Vault headlined lists are becoming the standard for Necrons, and honestly, it's exciting to see, after their bevy of nerfs since the release of their codex, that Necrons are still able to adapt and still have build variety inside their faction. Now, last but certainly not least this week, let's dive into some Genestealer Cults. This is using the new 10th edition codex for the faction, and I am excited to talk about these guys because this is kind of untread territory so far. Kieran Trimby went undefeated with Genestealer Cults at the Hometown 40k GT. This army was running the Xenocreed Congregation detachment. This is the hybrid focused detachment that gives you reroll advance and charge to your acolytes, metamorphs, and neophytes, as long as you have a character model leading those units. This included an acolyte icon ward with incendiary inspiration to give his attached unit advance and charge, 2 biophagus, 2 kellermorphs, as well as a locus, clamavis, magus, with deeds that speak to the masses. This gives you a once per turn reroll on your cult ambush roll, making it more likely that your units return from being destroyed. And last but certainly not least, a Primus with Denunciator of Tyrants. This gives you +1 to hit and wound to the entire unit when attacking a character unit. That is every attack, not only melee attacks, and not just the character model, the model's entire unit, with that +1 to hit and wound being absolutely brutal. Those characters were joined into one of the massive numbers of Acolyte Hybrid squads. Acolyte Hybrids now having multiple profiles, both a ranged-focused hand flamer profile and a melee-focused auto pistol profile, means you can take a ton of them. In this case, we had 4 10-man auto pistol squads, 1 5-man auto pistol squad, as well as a 10-man hand flamer squad with demolition charges, plus a smaller unit of 10 neophyte hybrids, a single Typical Goliath truck to get those guys up the table, plus 4 Achilles Ridge Runners, 1 unit of 2 and 2 units of 1, a unit of Pure Strain Genestealers to act as harassment and utility, alongside an Attilan Jackal squad, plus a big squad of 10 hybrid Metamorphs to act as the melee counterpunch. Super cool to see the Xeno Creed congregation in action. I think this is definitely one of the more interesting detachments coming out of Genestealer Cults. It's extremely offensively oriented with the ability to give its ranged weapons assault, improve their attacks with Frenzied Devotion or Vengeance for the Martyr, and once those units get destroyed by enemies, improve their ability to return with Cult Ambush using the Downtrodden Rise, allowing you to essentially reserve onto the table without using the normal Cult Ambush marker mechanic. It'll be interesting to see whether or not there is more innovation to be discovered within the Genestealer Cults faction, a codex that hasn't really done well since its release, but obviously huge congratulations to Kieran for taking down an event with the new codex. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comments section which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.